Well, welcome everybody to the September staff chat. My name is Priscilla Andrews. I'm the clinical manager here at the Cancer Wellness Center. If you're joining us for the first time, the staff chat series was designed to be a monthly series that when I sat down with one of my colleagues, either from the center or the community, to discuss issues and concerns of interest to people impacted by a cancer diagnosis. And I am very lucky today to be joined again. I think, is this your second or third staff chat, Michelle?
It might be my third.
Yeah, I keep pulling you back
It's been a
in.
while, but yeah.
But I'm very happy to have Michelle Mattero here today. She's one of the clinical associates here at the center, among other roles that she plays, to talk about anxiety and coping with the fear of recurrence. So Michelle, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
And what some of our viewing audience may be familiar with is the fact that the reason I asked you to be here is last year you both created, designed, and implemented a anxiety group. And so kind of just to start out with, what motivated you at that time to start the group?
So at that time, we had just entered a pandemic. So I think everybody's anxiety was at an all-time high. So that might have been what kind of initially got me thinking about it. But more so too, just how common anxiety is. And when we're dealing with such uncertain times, such as a pandemic, but certainly with a cancer diagnosis, it was just something that we see overwhelmingly and definitely saw a need for and wanted to be able to provide that in, at that time, what was like a group format.
Yeah. Well, and I think you kind of, as you're talking, I'm thinking about just sort of the layers for the cancer community related to anxiety and uncertainty, because here, we still are unfortunately kind of coping with this pandemic as we were last year, which brings its own anxiety and uncertainty. And then of course, the layer of the cancer diagnosis, just sort of this like extra helping of that. And I think that one of the things that I encounter a lot when it comes to like clients who are anxious, or maybe they don't use the word anxious, sometimes they'll talk about being really stressed or they'll talk about being really worried. Is there sort of this feeling I get for some people where they're like, am I going crazy? Like I've had clients actually just like straight up at the end of sessions say to me like, so am I crazy? Like, do you think I'm crazy? I'm curious how you would respond to that. I'm also sort of curious what your thoughts are about sort of how anxiety, worry, stress present for people dealing with cancer.
Sure. They're not crazy, right? This is something, I mean, it's such a natural response to stress. So I think off the bat, just normalizing that, because it can feel, I think that like, am I crazy, just comes from that overwhelm of there's so much out of my control right now. I can't make sense of it. And understanding that, our anxiety, that stress response is triggered when there's any type of threat, whether real or perceived, right? And a cancer diagnosis is a very real one. So that's normal. That's expected to have a response like that. That's natural. It's your brain's way of, protecting you. And in many ways, it's adaptive. That's how it keeps us safe. It's just when it becomes, right, like that worry, that excessive fear, that it's just too much, right? It's not productive. It's not helping us problem solve. It's actually interfering with that. Right? Like we're overly preoccupied with that worry. That's when I think, that's anxiety just kind of taking control, and when we want some strategies to use.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things, as you were talking, one of the things that came to my mind is what I find with many people I work with is that their primary way of coping with stressors and coping with stress is problem solving.
Mm-hmm.
And the challenge of a cancer diagnosis is you can be doing everything to problem solve the cancer diagnosis, and you're still dealing with the cancer diagnosis. The cancer diagnosis is still in process, and knowing you're doing everything doesn't always eliminate the worry and the anxiety. So,
Absolutely.
I think to what you were saying, like the problem stops being the stressor and starts being, how do we solve the anxiety?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Because when that first diagnosis hits, that anxiety, that stress response might be helpful, right? Okay, what's my treatment plan? How am I moving forward? But then, like you're saying, over time, we can't function at that level of such high anxiety. So when it becomes that we're kind of just really needing to find ways of adapting because there isn't a problem necessarily that we can solve in this immediate moment. So then it's how can I tolerate that uncertainty?
I mean, in your experience, like, what do you find are some of the like common, I guess I would call triggers, like common either triggers or anxieties that you found, either in the anxiety group, or you also run our stress reduction class. So just curious what can be sort of normal times for people to find that heightened anxiety.
Yeah, I think there's, a lot of maybe these like expected triggers, and then some of those that are unexpected that can just kind of come up and we don't realize why we're having that stress response.
Yeah.
Certainly upcoming scans, waiting for test results, right? Things that an anniversary of a diagnosis, or just bigger events like birthdays, things of that nature might be more expected. Managing side effects, right? Might not realize that that's something that's kind of just triggering that anxiety, and really just the nature of a cancer diagnosis and there being so much unknown. Any time that you're kind of put into that place of wanting, feeling like you need that certainty of knowing what's to come, and don't have those answers, are certainly triggering.
Can I say something that you said? I just want to go back for 1 second. That popped in my mind is talking about side effects. I actually find one of the number one side effects that tends to cause people anxiety, in my experience, is insomnia. And I'll just say a little preview. I know that you're working on some training related to insomnia. So sneak preview, audience, maybe she's going to be back here talking about that. But I mean, I'm curious if you found that, like, I just find that the sleeplessness paired with the daytime fatigue
Absolutely
just causes this like emotional upheaval for people because it feels out of control. I mean, to the point that you were making.
Yeah, absolutely. When we, think about, as we're saying that stress response is so normal and natural, but there are some of these things that are the very basics of putting us in a position that we're more like resilient to that stress, and ways that we can be more vulnerable, right? So especially things like sleep, right? Pain, having changes in appetite, things like that are kind of these very basics that we might have taken for granted. When those are being affected, we're so much more susceptible, and those can absolutely be triggering that anxiety.
Well, and I think the other thing too is those are both side effects from treatment. And I think you know where I'm going. And they're also symptoms of stress. So you just have this like compounding impact of why that anxiety level can climb kind of higher and higher.
Right. And sometimes too, when it's like a side effect, right, there might be this perception of, can I control that? And sometimes there might be, right? We want to be able to manage the side effects as best as we can. But sometimes that believing you can be in control of it is just going to keep that cycle going.
Yeah. Yeah. I think in particular, that makes me think of like people who are constantly researching. I mean, I don't know. This is taking it in a little bit different direction, but I think about like people who are always trying to find an answer versus like, I think about like fatigue in particular, like reaching a point of saying like, okay, this is what my energy level is and how do I adapt, where they're just like always trying to find that thing. Although the online research can go beyond side effects and be treatment, diagnosis, etc.
Yeah, right. And it's kind of trying to have that awareness of catching again where it's helpful, productive, and then where it's not, right? Am I looking something up because this is important for me to know and can help me manage my anxiety about this? Or am I looking for reassurance that is just reinforcing, this cycle of anxiety is something that, and that can be hard. It's difficult because wanting reassurance again is natural. It's we look for that, but it's really hard when we're really wanting a certain answer, or something that we think that's going to calm down this worry, and it won't.
Yeah. Well, and I think part of that too is like somebody who's always researching, something that I'll sort of kind of try to do an inventory with them on is like, how do I feel when I'm, number one, do I have to like cut myself off, or does like somebody in my family or my support network say, stop, you've got to stop, right? That's a good sign.
Right.
But also like, how do you feel at the end of the research? Like, do you end up feeling more settled and like, okay, I've got what I need? Or are there some of those symptoms of the anxiety and the stress present?
Right.
And
goes for, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
For, seeking kind of like medical advice, right? Or of course, we're going to advocate for asking those questions, being as involved as you can with, your healthcare team. But it's again, then seeing, am I overusing that? Am I asking questions, again, to seek that reassurance? And it's finding ways of catching yourself and checking in with how you feel after doing it is a great way to gauge that.
So when you're trying to help somebody kind of identify what their profile is of how anxiety presents, of how stress presents, and sometimes people are really good at articulating those things, and sometimes people just say, well, I feel anxious, and that's sort of the extent of it. Like, what are some of the symptoms that you see either are most common, or maybe even the ones that you screen for to understand like somebody's anxiety level?
Yeah. I think, thinking back to a couple of those things mentioned at the beginning, that like excessive worry, right? Feeling preoccupied. Anxiety, worry is very future oriented. So if we're, seeing a little bit of that lack of presence, of our thoughts, right? Being able to remain in that present moment, difficulty making future plans, avoidance of talking about cancer, noticing even your triggers, right? If you're finding just more and more things that are triggering you, so you're wanting to, be aware of that. And I think noticing your behavior a lot too, right? Are you on high alert? That reassurance seeking, is it happening on the internet? Is it happening with friends and family, with your doctors? Are all good indicators. Are you over monitoring your body? Right. And that's really hard because there's a little bit of this like distrust that people might experience with a cancer diagnosis in your body. Right. And
and you can't escape from it, right? It's not like everywhere you go, there you are.
Yeah. And right, like trying to have that approach of not judging yourself, but having that awareness of your body. How can I take care of myself? What keeps me in tune with how I'm feeling? How can I determine what's a side effect and what is just, a symptom of something else going on, or, a body sensation that I'm having. So I think just paying attention to those patterns, you certainly looking at like, the way that you're thinking. If you're finding that there's just a lot of that reaction, finding yourself again with like that, talking about the present moment, anxiety will keep us, if you had a car ride, you're in the car for an hour and you don't remember a single thing that you saw or did, right?
Yeah.
Noticing like that I'm just so preoccupied with a worry.
Yeah. And, I think there's something that you said in there, just to go back, that I thought was worth highlighting, which is anxiety can be preoccupation, but for some people, anxiety can also be avoidance.
Yeah.
I'm not going to talk about it. I don't want to go there. Like I've even had people who they change the route that they drive to avoid going by the hospital.
Yeah.
I think that's sort of almost a shadow side of anxiety that, unless we get into the realm of like PTSD, isn't talked about, because I think the preoccupation is so much more common, but I think that avoidant behavior can also have that same flavor, that same anxiety flavor to it as well.
Absolutely. Right. And it can be one of those things too. Like if I don't talk about it, it's not real, it's not there. So, and that can just make it so much harder to deal with, to manage.
Yeah.
So certainly that avoidance.
Which I will say, I think that this is making me think about, I think how to articulate the challenge of I have to think positively. Right. I mean, I think there's a lot of pressure around this idea of thinking positively, but I think the shadow side of that is then now I'm going to have anxiety about any emotion that I have that is not positive, and I better avoid them and I better not talk about them. Right. I mean, I think there's so many nuances to how anxiety, I think as we're talking about, there's so many nuances to how anxiety can present itself, sometimes sort of like slapping you in the face, right? I can't stop thinking about it. But then these other ways where we have these, as you said, behaviors that are really reflective of the internal struggle that we're having.
Absolutely. And I think that's why sometimes too, that awareness piece, right? When we become super aware of our anxieties and how it's presenting itself, can feel overwhelming at first. Noticing just how preoccupied I am, or how I'm, what my behavioral reactions are. It can be a lot. Yeah. And then just realizing, oh my gosh, like all of this negative thinking, how am I supposed to shift that? And right, it's being able to like take a step back, and again, not wanting to then overwhelm yourself with, oh my gosh, I'm so anxious and this needs to change right now.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and I think too, thinking about, I think something we talked about a little bit earlier is some of the like physiological signs of stress, right? Like thinking about the difficulty with sleep, or, the GI distress, the heart rate, the difficulty with breathing. I think the challenge with some of those physical symptoms is it then creates this feedback loop that keeps you in that cycle of having those sort of negative or catastrophic thoughts, those worry, anxious thoughts that just create this like self-perpetuation that is exhausting, right? People come in and they're like, I want this to stop.
Yep, absolutely. And we want to be able to to make sense of how we're feeling, right? Of what we're thinking. And we sometimes will put such like importance and belief on our thoughts or our feelings, when it's okay. Sometimes we can have a feeling or a thought that comes and goes, right? But we start to get that racing heart, sweaty palms. We're going to try to rationalize that, right? And say, there must be something that I need to worry about. I must be so fearful of this, right? When again, it's that response that we want to just be able to identify that it's happening, but not try to, keep reinforcing that cycle.
Yeah. I have to chuckle because recently I've been startled awake a couple times at night. So when I get startled, my heart is racing. And then my first thought is, wait, what am I worried about? What should I be worrying about right now?
Yeah.
Right. So
Mm-hmm.
there was something that you said in there. It's going to come back to me. So, I mean, I think the by the time we see people, I think most people are like, I've had enough. Like, please help me get out of this cycle. And I think also that gets paired with either the things I normally do to calm myself down are not working, or they're not accessible. I mean, I think that's come up a lot in COVID, but can also even be there without COVID. Or like, I've never had worry. Like, I don't know how to deal with this. I mean, what are some of the sort of starting places for you to help people if they're kind of maybe starting from scratch as far as how to attack the anxiety?
Yeah. And I think you bring up a good point of, sometimes the tools that worked before aren't working, they're not accessible to us, but it can certainly be helpful to examine that, like another time, right, of great stress, anxiety. What worked then, just to understand a little bit when we know our triggers, when we know our response, we can know better how to manage it. But it can be very likely that before I was able to manage it because it wasn't a real threat. It wasn't something that actually happened that I never thought could. So it might be presenting itself so differently. And that can really...
Can I pause for one second? Because I think what you're saying is important, which is, I think the thing that makes cancer anxiety a little bit different from other types of like generalized anxiety is like, there is something to worry about. Like, we can't deny the fact that there's a cancer diagnosis. Now, sometimes it gets inflamed to like people are catastrophizing around that anxiety, but like, it's not like other forms of anxiety where you can do like reality testing and being like, do you really have cancer?
Right.
No, I really have cancer.
Right. Yeah. And we're not going to sit there and say, oh, don't worry about the scan results, right? Some of that is a natural experience and something that is very worrisome, but it's how can we manage it, right? So I think even, as you bring up like catastrophic thinking, it can be helpful to look at some of those patterns, because it might not be how we always think, but we might notice a pattern that when we're under great stress, how distorted like does my thinking get, right?
Yeah.
And even just sometimes seeing that and being like, oh, that is so me, that's what's going on, can be helpful to just give context to what's going on in your brain, right? Like, this is your brain actually doing what it thinks it's supposed to.
Yeah.
So takes the pressure off of you a little bit of like, this is a natural experience happening, but we're going to try to, regain some of that control over our thoughts in a way that, and I hesitated to use the word control because a big piece of this is needing to release control, knowing what's not in our control. But when we think of the way we think, we can have a little bit more power over that than we tend to believe. So that's a great way of, first trying to look at managing anxiety.
Can I piggyback on something that you're saying here? Because I think you make this point of, can I notice the trend in the way I think that is then a sign to me that my brain's doing that thing again, which is called anxiety, or I use the word activation a lot when I'm talking to people. Like, when I'm activated, this is what my brain does. My brain perseverates. My brain, rejects what other people are saying, whatever it is. Because if we have some insight into that, like, it's almost like, can it become a symptom that helps us understand? Like, if I have a congested nose, that I go, oh, I have a cold. right?
Mhm.
Well, hopefully it's a cold and not COVID, but but like I have a cold, and so I understand that's why I have
Yeah,
this congestion versus like why am I congested and what's going on, right? That causes the anxiety. That
right.
if I recognize this is my pattern, then I can step back from the pattern and say something's going on right now, and I step out of the thing that's going on to recognize I have to do something to help this anxiety.
Mm-hmm. And even like that might seem, like a small task is huge. Because you're separating yourself from that thought,
Yeah,
right? And even if it comes back and it hooks you again, you took that time where you're looking at that thought, not from it,
yeah,
right? That can
yeah.
just be so powerful in and of itself of that's worry again, right? False
Mm-hmm.
alarm this time.
Yeah.
Not being hard on yourself that it's coming back up. It's coming up for a reason. You had a real threat that you needed to respond to, right? But trying to just better monitor when those are coming. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean I hear like kind of being attuned, becoming aware of like where your thoughts go, kind of the pattern of your thoughts,
Mhm.
um, maybe using that as insight to recognize that you're in an anxious state, that these are anxious thoughts. We're not going to separating out reality from the thoughts our brain is producing for us.
Yeah.
Um, what might be some of the other like dimensions of what you would recommend for people as they're kind of trying to work to manage that anxiety?
Yeah. So I think back to this idea of control. The more we feel out of control, the more our anxiety is going to go up, right? The more we focus on what's out of our control, because right now, the cancer, right, or a scan, a test, that's where my awareness is. So that's I'm focusing on, and that's out of my control. There are so many other things in our life that are out of our control, that are unknown, right? But we're just not putting those into our awareness right now.
Not focused on it.
Right. And there are so many other things that are in our control, but it's not our focus. But the more that we can shift our awareness, our focus on what is in our control, what is in my control in the here and now, will lower that anxiety level, right? The
Yeah.
more we focus on it. So trying, your best to keep yourself in that circle of what's in my control. And this was, such a lesson when COVID first hit, right? It was like there was so much outside of our own that wasn't in our control.
Yeah.
If we focused on that, everybody's right anxiety was heightened. And that was again a normal response. But eventually we were like, okay, this is longer than we thought. I'm not going to be able to live like this. How am I right now going to be? And you focus on what you can do, right? What you do know, what's in your control, what's in front of you today. Um, so
Are
that
there
can,
certain starting places that can be helpful if people are having a difficult time with that, or maybe even in your experience, like what people have turned to that have helped them regain some of that internal
yeah.
control?
So certainly, like mindfulness, meditation techniques. And I know that can come off as sometimes people, might just be like, oh, that's not for me, right? Like, and especially when we're having anxious thoughts, thinking of like having a quiet space of sitting alone with those can be super anxiety provoking. But when we better understand what some of those techniques are and how there's something for everybody, right? Not
Mm.
everyone's going to be able to lay down and visualize themselves on a beach, and that's okay, right? It's a practice, and it's about grounding yourself and harnessing. We all have that ability to shift our awareness, to bring ourselves, even if it's just for a moment.
Mm-hmm,
We can
mm-hmm.
do it. So I always encourage people, even if like you're turned off by it or you're just not sure you can, we're not going to be focusing on judging ourselves during this, right? Like that's the opposite of what we even want. It's a judgment-free zone, and it's cool to see how they're able to strengthen their ability to shift their awareness and what that can do for you. And then it's so much easier to adapt into your everyday life, right?
Well, and I think the thing that's interesting of what you're talking about is there's sort of this double layer of control, of an experience of control, right? Because there's the control of, I am doing this practice, right? I am having a daily meditation or a regular time that I set aside for visualization, whatever it is, right? That alone gives some sense of control of I'm doing something.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the moment, the practice of becoming more aware of even those brief moments. And in the beginning, I think they can be quite fleeting, which is normal. I think people think mindfulness is like all I'm doing is focused on my breathing the whole time, in and out, which God bless monks who do that all day long. But that like, oh, like I at least have the capacity intermittently to catch my mind wandering and come back.
Right. And even, some people might think too, like taking time to meditate is, alone in a quiet room. And, there's guided meditation and mindfulness practices for a reason, right? It's so normal for our minds to get distracted. So having practices where you are being guided, where you can focus on, a voice and have that be something to reinforce. Certainly for some people, that's always how they'll practice, and that's great and fine. And for some, you find that over time, you can kind of internalize that voice and find it yourself. But it's not to expect yourself, like you're saying, to just kind of sit quietly by yourself and be able to
go cold turkey. You're not going cold turkey.
Yeah.
I'm just curious because from having run the group, I know there's like so many different like apps and websites that kind of can offer those guided meditations. Is there one or two, like, are there a couple that you like in particular like or recommend or have found people had success with?
Yeah. There are so many, and I have to say that there are so many really wonderful ones. A very popular one is the Calm app. And there are a lot too that are free, don't require, any type of subscription.
Headspace, is Headspace like that?
Headspace is another great one. I actually have a list of apps that I don't know if there's like a space that we can share. This that can kind of show. And what's nice with there's Stop, Breathe, Think, which is another nice one, that'll even categorize it like if you're outside walking and want some type of, like meditation or mindfulness experience. If you're trying to go to sleep, right? If you want one to feel awake and refreshed to start the day, can get really specific, which is awesome.
Yeah, different options for different people.
Yeah,
and different circumstances as well.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I was just thinking about this idea of control, right? Of having there be a practice that maybe gives you more confidence in your ability to shift, i.e. have some moments of control over where your mind is going. I think there's also the opportunities that people can sometimes miss of what do I have control over in my day-to-day life that may be seem like small gestures, but I think to the point that you were saying before, that like when things feel out of control, that can eclipse our appreciation of what is in our control. Like, I'm thinking about things like, like I'll often talk to people about like routine. Like, do they have a routine? Like, is there a time that they get up in the morning? Do they have sort of a morning ritual, which could include mindfulness? But like maybe I get up, I get to decide I'm going to have my cup of coffee. I always take a shower. I always get dressed. Like, I think some of those things can also be like a lived choice that people get to make.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Routine is is huge. I think too, you mentioned, like finding the things to like appreciate, and certainly, many people in the anxiety groups, or just, people I've worked with, find that practicing, like having gratitude practices can be super beneficial. Sometimes I get that nobody necessarily wants to hear, oh, but find that, find things to
Count
be
your
grateful for.
blessings.
Yes, right. So it's certainly, again, what works for people, and when you're ready, and when that's something that you're receptive to.
Yeah.
Because it can be really hard if that wasn't a practice that we always did before, right? So again, to kind of be gentle with yourself and see, but a lot of the times that is really, really helpful, just in general for us, whether it's first thing in the morning or last thing before bed, to think of 3 things, right, that we're grateful for in that day.
Yeah.
And it's another way of, again, focusing on some of the good, and not always discounting maybe the good one.
Well, and I think that there's the way that gratitude practice is sometimes talked about, that can come off as like, just be positive and
Right.
look at all your blessings, like that sort of like almost
Right.
Pollyanna-ish way of looking at it. Whereas I think for most therapists, when we're talking about a gratitude practice, it's not like an either or. It's not like, let's pretend that you're not feeling worried, or pretend that you're not sad or angry. That
Right.
can also coexist with, can we just turn our attention over here to like not put the scale on it so the scale goes like this, but at least put the thumb on the scale so that it at least maybe reaches a little bit of equilibrium, has the potential of reaching a little bit more equilibrium.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah.
I know that you do our stress reduction class. So I'm curious, with the practices that you do in there, if there are like kind of other aspects of managing that stress or managing that anxiety that have been a part of that class, or that you kind of add to the list of like, hey, this might be something to try.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of what we do in the stress reduction class is,
Which is on Tuesdays at 1:15.
that's right.
Just a little plug. Just want to make sure, everybody. Tuesdays 1:15.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Okay. On Zoom. Okay.
A lot mindfulness meditation based, but a lot too of, finding that, just like that mind body connection. And I like to mix it up, because it's just so interesting hearing, from those that have started, months and months ago, and then seeing new people, and how they're finding really like what's their like favorite, right? And or new people just saying like, man, that was so hard today. Maybe it was because like I was super overwhelmed, or I'm finding that this practice is, is better for me. And very often when we, it's just really cool to see how through like a meditative practice, progressive muscle relaxation is one that is a lot of people's favorites.
Yeah.
Because
wait, in case people don't know, can you describe what progressive muscle relaxation is? Because I always get questions about what the hell I'm talking about when I talk about that.
So that's working through all of the muscles, through your body that you can gently tense and release. Sometimes we work our way from head to toe, sometimes from toes to and up, which is interesting too, to see how like that differs for people.
Sure.
But again, it's finding control. That's something that we can be doing, while we're waiting for our food, to the dinner to be ready, things like that we can be incorporating, that release so much stress and tension that we might be holding in our physical body, holding in our mind space, being able to let go of. And it's been so nice to see people that are giving themselves that half hour, 45 minutes a week.
Yeah.
And sometimes that being, you know, enough to kind of keep with them that feeling of calm, finding that peace and being able to return to it later in the day, later in the week.
Yeah. Well, and I think the thing that I really appreciate about progressive muscle relaxation is it really responding to the physiological response in the body that is associated with anxiety.
Yeah.
Because when we get activated, the first thing that our body does without thought is we tense up our muscles because we're getting ready to do something. We're getting ready to like fight or run away.
Right.
And so, you know, that idea I think I talked about earlier of like, if we look at the anxiety as the problem that we're going to solve, I think a further down the line is, can we look at how our body is responding and causing us to have these anxious thoughts? Because sometimes if we put the thought, we don't even worry about changing the thought, but we do something in our body like progressive muscle relaxation. The end result is, wow, at some point when we got to the abdomen in the progressive muscle relaxation, my mind stopped wandering and I started just focusing on the sensation more and more, and I felt more and more relaxed. And we're not even telling ourselves stop thinking about that worry thought. We're just giving this thing for us to keep coming back and focusing on.
Right. And I think too, as you had mentioned before about like focusing on the breath too, right? Like that can just sound like daunting at first of, you know, this is something I'm doing all day, every day. Because again, it's not that we don't, you know, we're trying to push those thoughts away, avoid them, but by shifting your awareness, even noticing, like so often it's like, we don't even know how we breathe, right?
Oh, yeah.
Like, is it through my chest? Is it in my belly? What sound does it make? How often do I take a full and complete breath?
Thank you for that cue. I just noticed myself inhale deeply there.
Yeah. And it's, you know, and people, you know, it's like take 3 deep breaths. But even when you think that, are you really, right? Like taking 3 full inhales, full exhales, you'll notice a physiological change right after those 3.
Yeah.
And, you know, that gives you a preview into just how much, you know, you can do with your awareness.
And, you know, I think something that you had talked about is the practice of this. And I kind of want to highlight that because I think people get frustrated. I mean, I understand we're sort of in this culture of like immediate gratification. And especially if you've been suffering, I think people want that relief. But the reality, like some of these strategies, some of these activities that we can do, like the more you practice them, the more effective they're going to be, the more efficient they're going to be, the more familiar you're going to be with them. I remember I had a client, the first time I taught her progressive muscle relaxation, we got like a quarter of the way in and she started laughing and could not stop laughing because it just was so foreign to her. It kind of felt silly, but she stuck with it. And then over time, I saw her here for all the different classes. Like she got more comfortable and really, I think, reaped the benefits of it. So there was feedback saying, yeah, keep doing this.
Absolutely. It's a practice. It's nothing, there's no right or wrong way of doing it, but you find what works for you. And that's where that control comes from. You know, in every stress reduction class, you know, I'm like, you created this state of calm, of peace, of relaxation for yourself.
Yeah.
And
that's a good
really
reminder.
Yeah.
I'm looking at the clock. It's right at 1 o'clock. I'm very proud of myself because I am a horrible timekeeper. So I always am like, success. I want to thank you so much. Such an interesting conversation. And I feel like 45 minutes doesn't do it justice. We could keep talking here, but if people are interested in this, they can see you for stress reduction class. Can you say again where they can see you for that?
So that is every Tuesday on Zoom. at 1:15, and you can register on our events calendar on our website
That's
to be
great.
part of that.
And if people would like to hear more from you about anxiety, you have a program coming up next month, right?
Yes. So this is just the start of an anxiety series that I'm hoping to do, here on out. We'll see. But October 13th will be the first of it that is going to be focusing on anxiety around the fear of cancer recurrence. So please feel free. You can register on our website. It'll be an evening program. So I'd love to see y'all there.
Thanks so much for being here, Michelle. I appreciate the conversation. So interesting, and I think such an important topic because it's just so common for the cancer community. Thank you to those of you who joined us here in Zoom, on Facebook Live, perhaps if you're viewing this on YouTube. Thanks for joining us. I will be back here again next month. On October 20th, I'll be joined by our clinical director, Megan McMahon, and we'll be talking about body image and esteem during and following a cancer diagnosis. So I hope you'll consider joining us. Thanks for being here today. Thanks again, Michelle.
Thanks so much.